We are now in the third act of a global confrontation which has so far seen two world wars. This is not the Third World War, probably. This is probably what we do instead of the Fourth World War, because the Third World War should have been the Cold War.
So we're seeing reports that 2,200 Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Units are being deployed to the Middle East on the USS Tripoli. From your perspective, Peter, does this look like a ground invasion in Iran is about to happen?
The simple answer to that is no. And a ground invasion of Iran would need to be multiple times bigger than the ground invasion of Iraq in 2003. So if you were going to invade Iran, you would need pretty much the entire US Army ready to go on either the borders of Iraq or Turkey or Pakistan. That is obviously not happening. It would take a very long time for that to happen. To put it in context, the decision to invade Iraq was probably made in about 2002, and it took until January of 2003 to get even a fraction of those forces on the ground. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do stuff with those Marines. So a Marine Expeditionary Unit consists of a Marine amphibious assault ship, so something like the USS America or the USS Tripoli. It means you've got a Marine Expeditionary Force embarked on that, which is a pretty chunky bunch of thousands of Marines with helicopters. It means you've got the F-35B attack jet, which is the same thing the Royal Navy use. That's a vertical takeoff jet. Can take off from the assault carrier, but even more usefully, it can take off from things like car parks. So you're talking about the most credible amphibious force that you can have in the world, and you're talking about one of them. So the US would need many of them to carry out an invasion of someone like Iran. To seize something like Kargh Island, which is where the main energy supplies are based, will be much less. But even more importantly, that force can evacuate every US diplomatic mission in the Middle East simultaneously. So there's lots of things it can do. It's surrounded by lots of destroyers and submarines, and obviously it's got two aircraft carriers with it. So this is how the world's preeminent global superpower does business, when it's seriously signaling that it could do more. It would also incidentally allow them to drop a very significant force into somewhere like Tehran to hold or kill or do something. So, for example, it could evacuate every European diplomatic mission from Tehran under a massive air cover, because don't forget, we're not just talking about ships at sea. We're talking about a whole US force package that includes those jets at RAF Fairford. That's the B-1B bombers. It includes the B-52s, and it includes what is by far the most powerful military force in the United Kingdom, which is, of course, I'm afraid, with apologies to the Royal Air Force, Royal Navy, and British Army, the US Air Force package at RAF Lakenheath and Mildenhall, which has F-35s, it has F-22s, it has airborne early warning aircraft, which is a force that could, frankly, decapitate the entire military of the UK in an hour. And all of those aircraft are capable of flying to the Middle East, together with all the other aviation in Europe, all of the other stuff, including the US aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. So we're talking about the world's preeminent superpower, the power that won World War II, positioning forces to give itself the maximum possible options in the Middle East, including deploying large numbers of US Marines.
You mentioned Kargh Island there. How could it look if they were to go in, or if they targeted the coastal areas in Iran? Is that an option they are seriously considering?
I mean, you talk to someone like Pete Hegseth or anyone else who's been Secretary of Defense, and this is not a Trump administration point, and they will point out that they always have plans for everything. They probably don't have a plan to decapitate the UK military using US forces just based in the UK, because they don't need to, and they don't want to, and they have a close enough relationship. They definitely have a plan to strike every missile battery on the coast of Iran with the most missiles they can do. They're also very keen not to do that because they don't have that many of those missiles. So if you think about what's happening in the wider world, take 3 steps back, and what do you see? 3 steps back, what you see is the US being extremely worried about China, and that means it does not wish to use up all its Tomahawk missiles. It means it does not wish to use up all of its Patriot air defense missiles, and it also does not wish to deploy too many stealth jets forward in ways that might get back to the governments of China or Russia, which are, of course, the two primary adversaries for the United States. So there's lots of things it doesn't want to do. Kargh Island, I mean, the first thing it could do if it so wished is destroy all energy infrastructure in Kargh Island with an incredibly small number of weapons. So destroy Iran's ability to export oil for the foreseeable future. They probably don't want to do that. It would be disruptive to oil markets, but not very disruptive, because we're not talking about, we're not talking about destroying Saudi Arabia's oil capability here, right? Also, really important to remember that the US is now borderline energy independent and has been since the Obama administration. So this is not the 2000s when destroying Middle East infrastructure was bad for the US. The US can afford to destroy for all of the energy infrastructure in the Middle East to be destroyed. However, because there is a global energy market, that would push global oil prices above $200 a barrel, which is the highest they've been arguably ever since the 70s. At the moment, they're merely the highest they've been since 2008, which was just before the global financial crisis, which is a very different kind of dynamic. So the US wants maximum flexibility to do things, and it is giving itself a wide number of options to do so. And it's wanting to do so to an extent in conjunction with its allies, and primarily that means its Gulf allies. Also means its European allies, because with the exception of the slight row over the UK bases, it has the ability to deploy whatever it needs from its bases in Turkey, with which it has a close and what I would refer to as an adult relationship, Italy, with which it has a close and adult relationship, Germany, with which it has what I would refer to as an extremely adult relationship, because that is informed by the aftermath of World War II. So it's a very complex relationship based on defeating that country. And its relationship with the UK, which I would remind you was described by Sir Alex Younger, the former head of MI6, as an infantilized relationship.
If US boots actually hit Iranian soil, is there a tactical path to victory, or are we looking at the next Vietnam War?
So, I mean, this is not going to be Vietnam. Vietnam was a decade-long intervention launched by the US that started after the French imperial withdrawal, then ramped up under first Eisenhower and then Kennedy and then Johnson, involved sending conscripted US soldiers, did not involve the UK because Harold Wilson decided not to get involved, and went on for years. In some ways, that's the equivalent of Iraq, although the difference in Iraq was that the US never had to introduce the draft. There is, I think, no circumstance under which Donald Trump, who is very, very, very aware that he was quite lucky to have escaped being sent to Vietnam, or anyone currently serving in the US military who has been learning a lot about Vietnam, and all of whom served in Iraq, are not going to make that mistake. I would be astounded if we saw large numbers of US combat forces deployed in Iran over a prolonged period of time. A more interesting question is, what do the Americans and Israelis already have on the ground in Iran? To which the answer is almost certainly Iranian sources who are taking enormous risks with their lives. But we don't know that. We don't know that for very good reasons, because it would be very, very highly classified. Are there any people in US uniform or Israeli uniform on the ground in Iran? We also don't know that, because it would also be very highly classified. But my guess, based on not being an idiot, would be that the answer is no. We are talking about the United States, which, regardless of what you think of President Donald Trump, is by far the most skilled and experienced military on the planet, operating alongside Israel, which, while it operates on a very much smaller basis, and I would point out has a defense budget 20% lower than the United Kingdom, and between them, they are giving themselves the maximum possible number of options right now.
In terms of when we cast our mind back to the 70s with the Iranian Revolution, a big factor in that was the tape cassette, the spread of information and ideas from the Ayatollah, and the big urban action movement. And we're seeing now open source information having an effect where Iranians are giving the US some information on coordinates and where some military people are. There are reports that airstrikes have been called in that way. How do you see this revolution unfolding? They don't have arms, but how is this going to pan out, do you think?
Well, I think it's a good question. But you've got to remember, this is neither the first, second, or fifth episode of this story. Right. This story goes back to the government of the Shah, and indeed specifically, it goes back to the coup in Iran launched in the 50s by the US and UK. So we're talking about the CIA bringing in what was a rather unpleasant secret police, sort of utilizing government of Iran under the Shah. That was then ousted, as you just pointed out, by the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So that's already happened. And then we started to see social media fueled unrest in 2009 with the Green Revolution. Now, are there Iranians who would like to see a US intervention? Very likely, probably. Are there Iranians who would like to see a return of the monarchy? Maybe. Are there Iranians who are prepared to die for their beliefs? Absolutely, definitely, because we know that they've been doing that in quite large numbers. They did it in 2009 under Obama, and they did it more recently under Trump. And under both those circumstances, the Obama and the Trump administrations, which are not as different as people close to the Obama and Trump administrations would like us to believe, they're both governments in the United States facing really complex things, have been trying to work out what to do. What the Obama administration did, and the Trump administration is clearly continuing, was a bunch of covert operations inside Iran that included things like Stuxnet and so forth. We know this has been reported by people like the New York Times. Unquestionably, and that was a joint operation, according to the New York Times, between the Americans and Israelis. That clearly has continued. So again, do not underestimate the level of historical awareness in either the US military, which remembers that it won the Second World War, or even more the Israeli military, which remembers that it is the Jewish state that goes back to the time of King David. So that's not someone this is not someone you can read about on social media. This is the man who wrote the Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, all that kind of stuff. We're going back to the dawn of recorded human history, and where everyone in the Israeli state, particularly Mossad and the military, has ancestors and indeed people they knew who came out of concentration camps in 1945. So they do not screw about, and they do not screw about with good reason, because they believe that they are threatened by a region that may genocide them. And then you've got this taking place in conjunction with the Gulf monarchies, who have their own very specific history, going back through, for example, Lawrence of Arabia, the freedom, the fight for what they viewed as freedom from Turkey. So these are really serious countries doing really serious things while trying to maintain the maximum possible flexibility in an era where what the US is most worried about is a war with China. Does that all make sense?
It's interesting how it's all intertwining.
It's intertwining very deeply. Can I just make another quick point? So by far the most effective UK military unit operating in plain sight at the moment is a very small team called UKMTO. Stands for United Kingdom Maritime or Marine Trade Operations, and it is the UK Ops Room manned by, I visited it in 2013 during the Somali pirate crisis when it was manned by about 5 reservists, one of whom described himself as a school janitor from Glasgow. So we're talking about really normal people. But what they do is they act as the ops room for all shipping in the Indian Ocean. So if you are a Indian or Thai or a West African flagged tanker wishing to transit the Strait of Hormuz, then you read their traffic, and it tells you whether it's safe to go through Hormuz or not. And at the moment, obviously, it says it isn't. The only 2 tankers to make it through in the current week, so that is the third complete week of March, were 2 Indian tankers that ran Hormuz in the first half of the week, and they weren't struck. Now that tells us that India, and this is where we get to big history again, India has managed to strike a deal with both the Americans and the Iranians to get their shipping through. And that is important because the last 3 world wars, the Napoleonic War, the First World War, and the Second World War, were all won by the country and the side that managed to get most Indians to fight for them. So why did we dominate India in the Napoleonic Wars? Because Wellington had won a bunch of fights in India before he came back to fight in the Peninsula, and before he won at Waterloo. We won in the First War because we had Indian volunteers to back up the rest of the British Army, and the same was true in the Second World War, during which time the Japanese were also recruiting Indians. So the world always belongs to whoever keeps the Indians on side. The Indians now play a really interesting quadruple-sized game between the Russians, who they've always been friends with, the Americans, who they have a partnership with, and the Chinese they share a border with. So this is really, really big 1,000-year geopolitics going on at the moment, and you can track it through the movement of individual tankers.
The Strait of Hormuz is a good example of asymmetric warfare that we're seeing there with the Iranian, the IRGC and their attack boats causing absolute mayhem and holding the world to ransom, essentially. How is the US going to deal with that? And how, in terms of Asia, because 75% of Japanese oil comes through there, and a huge amount of Chinese as well. So at what point do the Asian countries get involved?
They're already involved. They're just not conducting strikes. They are already deeply, deeply involved in this. There is a phrase that people use in the military. I should say at this point, I'm a British Army reservist. So there's a phrase called trading space for time, or indeed trading anything for time. Donald Trump has agreed to sit down with Xi Jinping and have a chat, which is going to be heavily about Taiwan and microchips and all of the other stuff that we were thinking about before we started thinking about Hormuz. And he has just said he wants to put that off for, I think, about a month. So the Chinese are already involved. The Chinese don't want to be bombing Iran because Iran is sort of a light ally of theirs. They sure as hell don't want to be bombing the Americans. And the Chinese have very, very complex but quite well negotiated relationships with the Arab states who hate each other. So Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, we all think of as being the same thing, part of the Gulf Cooperation Council, but they actually have very specific disagreements and rivalries. They all hire British people to do their accountancy, law, and train their militaries. But they have very, very serious rivalries around things like the Muslim Brotherhood, their understanding of Islam, their understanding of everything. So they're all rivals, and they all have been negotiating separately bilateral relationships with the US, with China, and with Iran. And most of them have separate bilateral relationships with India and Pakistan. If you look at what is happening in Afghanistan now, which is and has always been, when I said 1,000-year geopolitics, we're now going to talk 3,000-year geopolitics, and Alexander the Great. So Afghanistan, where things go wrong. Afghanistan currently being pulled between the Turks, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Chinese, and the Russians in particular. Also the Iranians. Obviously, there's a border with Iran. There was an airstrike, I think, in Kabul. Yes, there have been several strikes in Kabul, conducted by primarily the Pakistanis. That to me suggests that the Indians have a growing presence in Afghanistan that the Pakistanis find unpleasant. Some of you have heard the phrase, the Great Game, right? The Great Game was the Victorian battle over the future for India waged in the Himalayas and particularly in Afghanistan. That game is also back on, and actually the nearest maritime choke point to that Great Game is the Strait of Hormuz, or Straits of Hormuz, depending on how you refer to it. So that also into the Persian or Arabian Gulf, both of which are proper names for it. And Reuters makes a point of never using them properly because obviously the Persian Gulf suggests that the Iranians are the important ones, and the Arabian Gulf suggests that the Arabs are the important ones. So there is a battle going on for Afghanistan. There is a battle going on for the supply of energy to everywhere that is not the United States, because we are dependent heavily on Gulf energy, and by we I mean the Europeans, particularly if we're not dependent on the Russians. The Asians definitely are. That means the Chinese and the Japanese have the same problem. And we could try and force the Straits of Hormuz with a joint European-Asian force, but we're not going to for two good reasons. Firstly, the Americans don't want the Asians to pull any ships out of the Far East where they're confronting China. And secondly, because the only capable real strike platform in the European navies is the French carrier Charles de Gaulle, which is currently in the Mediterranean and doesn't really need to move any closer because there's already two big American carriers down the Gulf.
You mentioned there the Arab states. One of the alliances that's emerging is between Qatar and Turkey. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit? I mean, Turkey's interesting because it's part of NATO and has the second largest army in NATO. How is that unfolding?
To understand that, you need to go back to the days of Colonel Lawrence of Arabia. And remember that the last time anything this important was happening in the Middle East that wasn't World War II was the First World War. And that was about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire at that stage extended from Turkey all the way down to the Gulf. So what Lawrence did, so Colonel Lawrence of Arabia, and of course, more importantly, the Arabs, there was an Arab revolt against the Turks, and that broke up the Middle East into its rough present sort of constituent parts, less the State of Israel, obviously, which was founded after World War II. So Qatar is extremely supportive of an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood, which is essentially, while Qatar is a monarchy, the Muslim Brotherhood has traditionally comes from a similar sort of background to they're different. They're different, but Turkey, there was a revolution in Turkey and it was taken over by Ataturk, which is a secular revolutionary force, if that makes sense. So you have lots of Middle East politics that go back about a century and a half. Qatar is unpopular with Saudi and Egypt and the UAE because it backs the Muslim Brotherhood. Turkey is vaguely seen as Muslim Brotherhood adjacent, if you saw it in its current state, as a secular, non-religious state, albeit with President Tayyip Erdogan, who is the most Islamist, he's not Islamist, the most proudly Muslim leader that country has had since Ataturk. And Ataturk the man who came out of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, because the Turks who fought at Gallipoli against the British and Australians then went and established the modern Republic of Turkey. So all of this stuff goes back to the First World War, which reminds you that the First World War and the Second World War. So if you remember where Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party came from, who do you think was backing them in the 1940s? You guessed it, it was the Nazis. So we are now in the third act of a global confrontation which has so far seen 2 world wars. This is not the Third World War, probably. This is probably what we do instead of the Fourth World War, because the Third World War should have been the Cold War.
There's been sort of ex-Mossad officials warning about the Qatar and Turkey partnership because of a potential vacuum caused by the US hammering Iran. Who else do you see jostling for position there? Is the Saudi and UAE partnership going to...
I mean, the Saudi and UAE partnership has already been very, very complicated. So the Saudis struck a bunch of Qatari vehicles in Yemen, so not vehicles with people in them, in January. So that's clearly a bit dodgy. But you were just talking about the Mossad, so I think it's worth looking at what Israel's priorities are here. Israel is not that worried about Qatar or Turkey because it doesn't share a border with Qatar or Turkey. What Israel shares a border with is Jordan, which doesn't worry them very much because that deal has been going, they've got a long-term deal with Jordan. They've got a long-term deal with Egypt. Those deals are very complicated, but both those countries, and it's based around the future of the Palestinian people. So both Jordan and Egypt have always said they would immediately invade Israel if the Palestinian populations of Gaza and the West Bank were forcibly expelled into Egypt or Jordan. Now, that is never going to happen because that is what one might call, or one would have called, a gentleman's agreement in the old days, i.e. mutually assured destruction. That means that what Israel is concerned about is obviously Gaza, which they've now been bombing for 3 years, and they're now trying to work out what they do next. Lebanon, where they have decapitated Hezbollah, first with those pager attacks a couple of years ago that people will remember, then with those strikes that followed on, and with the strikes that are still going on. They're removing that threat. And the other place they're concerned about, of course, is Syria, which is currently in a state of flux, where the Turks and the Israelis and the Arab states and the Americans are in a complex relationship with the post-Assad government. So this is all very, but again, you think back to the Mossad. Where does the Mossad come from? The Mossad comes out of Auschwitz. The people who found the Mossad, that first thing that they do is, when they say never again, they mean we're going to take the Jewish people back home or to the US. There are 6 million Jewish people in Israel. There are 6 million Jewish people in the US roughly by now. That's just a coincidence. But the Holocaust was horrific. And they intend never to happen again. The first big lethal operations of the Mossad were in the 60s, and they were against Nazi German scientists in Egypt working on weapons that could devastate Israel. So chemical warheads in ballistic missiles. So the Mossad, more than any other organization in the world, looks at the world through what happens if they try to genocide us again, and tries to make sure that doesn't happen. And that, of course, is why Israel has a nuclear deterrent. I think it's probably a good point now to talk about Britain, because it is worth pointing out that Israel is a nuclear weapon state and continues to be a nuclear weapon state while spending less than us on defense. If you can achieve what Israel achieves on a basis while spending... Britain has been the largest defense spender in Europe for most of the 21st century. We have built submarines, we have built aircraft carriers, we've built a not very good tank called Ajax. We have spent, people say we need to spend more on defense now because of the Russian threat. Fairly clearly, we need to spend more wisely, because if we spent it as unwisely as we had in the last 25 years, we would buy a lot more things that didn't work. Now, again, I would point out that I'm a serving military reservist, so I'm not going to criticize my chain of command too much on an interview. And I would again point out that there's that 6-person team at UK MTO that we were talking about earlier. Like, the most effective 6 people in the entire Middle East who aren't in Mossad are ordinary British reservists coordinating all shipping movement across about a third of the planet. And they did a very good job during Somali piracy, and I went to see them, and it was amazing to watch them, because every time a ship phoned up saying we're being attacked by Somali pirates, they would task the nearest warship, which might have been Turkish, or it might have been Egyptian, or it might have been Indian, and it could even, in extremis, have been Russian or Chinese. So there is stuff that we are really, really good at. deciding how to spend defense money is not necessarily it. Nevertheless, again, there's a reason the Gulf states have, British people advising their militaries. There's a reason why the closest relationship that the US military has is still to the British. So there will be British liaison officers or exchange officers on those carriers. There'll probably be Royal Marines on that assault ship, not many, but there'll probably be a Royal Marine captain or lieutenant or corporal somewhere who's doing an embed, and they will probably be talking in real time to the Ministry of Defence about whether those individuals could be used in a landing on Kargh Island, if it comes to that, which it probably won't. So on some levels we know what we're doing, on some levels we don't, but that has always been the way, because that is the way of our people, and that's just the way Britain works.
Just moving on to Vladimir Putin now, what do you think he makes of all of this, the developments in Iran? Is he happy that the West is distracted by all this?
Depends what Vladimir Putin's priorities are, and I've never met him. He definitely sees himself as a Russian patriot. His elder brother actually died of diphtheria at the siege of Leningrad. Usually referred to as starving to death, but Putin's always been pretty clear it was an infection. When Russia was nearly overrun, obviously the Soviet Union at the time, by the Nazis in World War II. So I suspect at his core, he has that similar sort of Mossad approach to never again. He came up through St. Petersburg. I should say at this point, I've just written a book called The Next World War about sort of global geopolitical tensions, which touches on this. His judo teacher in St. Petersburg was almost certainly very, very involved in organized crime. And an organized crime legend in the St. Petersburg mafia called Leo the something or other. But I think it is reasonable to assume that Vladimir Putin believes himself to be a Russian patriot who believes that Russia needs an enormous buffer zone. The most interesting line, it's not in my book, it's in Jens Stoltenberg's autobiography. Jens Stoltenberg, most of you remember, Norwegian Secretary General of NATO for most of the last decade. So Stoltenberg was told by Medvedev, when Medvedev was Russian president, you've got to take the long view. We have been attacked once every century by a psychopath out of Europe. And those psychopaths are, if anyone who listens to the rest is history, Charles XII of Sweden, Napoleon, and Hitler. And as Medvedev pointed out in 2014, we're not a long way into that century. Now, that's me being charitable about Putin. The less charitable way of looking at it is that if you were worried about Russia being overrun by a continental European psychopath, the time to stop supporting the far right in Germany and France was very, very early, and the next best time is now. Because we currently have the rise of right-wing parties in France and Germany and in Poland, and on the off chance they all end up in power at once, and a fight breaks out with Russia, that will not feel very clever. So, there is a lot of history going on now. I mean, some of your readers and viewers will be in their 30s or 40s now, and will remember the end of the Cold War and this idea of the end of history. Well, the bad news is history isn't over, it wasn't over, and now it's restarting at the speed of what the British Army euphemistically refers to as relevance, and I would refer to as an unbelievably large amount of things happening all at once. So, we can't stop any of this happening because it was all done by stuff that we should have done, possibly feeling quite sensible at the time, over the last 40 years. That includes the rich Russians owning half the UK housing market in London. I slightly exaggerate. It includes the complex relationship we have with China. It includes the complex relationship we have with Europe. It includes people called Keir being in powerful positions in the Labour Party. All of this stuff is the consequence of stuff that happened a long time ago. And now, Donald Trump is the most powerful person in the world. Xi Jinping is the most powerful person in the world. Vladimir Putin is quite powerful. And they're all trying to do they're all trying to defuse this bomb that they have built. And the UK military is obviously stuck somewhere in the Mediterranean at the moment because it can't get any ships through the Suez Canal without borrowing American destroyers. And they don't have any spare destroyers because the world is on fire. So everything is sort of fine, but also sort of unbelievably dangerous because we haven't even discussed nuclear weapons yet. And everyone is trying to sort of get out of this alive while not killing any more people than they feel they need to. And that is bad news for the Iranian regime because they're being decapitated at the speed of being tracked down by cruise missiles or drones.
Would Putin dare help Iran even more and essentially face US head on by doing that? There's reports of him providing satellite imagery to the Iranians. Do you think that would happen?
Well, I don't forget, I mean, Putin, Russia is only able to maintain its fight in Ukraine because it's supported by China. So there is almost no point in asking what Putin would be prepared to do, because if it is remotely risky, he has to run it past his big brother, and his big brother is Xi Jinping. So, if the Chinese cut off supplies to, and also, but at the same time, of course, Russia is supplying energy to China. And it's the only way China can get energy if the Gulf blows up. So Putin's not in a powerless position here. When I say he speaks to his big brother, I mean, they're almost the same age, actually, Xi Jinping and Putin. And Putin is, I think, 2 years older, but I may have it the wrong way around. So he's able to say, look, we can give you all the energy you need by pipelines and, if necessary, trains. So if this goes wrong, we can keep I can keep the lights on in Shanghai. But of course, Xi Jinping can say, yes, but I can remove your ability to fight a war in no time at all. So they are obviously, and the Americans can probably intercept most of their satellite communications. If you see what I mean. So there is a, and almost certainly, the Russians and Chinese don't know whether that's true on any given day. The second point is that they don't know on any given day whether American stealth bombers can penetrate their airspace and take out their bunkers the way that Ali Khamenei was. And the Americans don't know either, because the only way to do that is to fly the stealth bomber through Russian and Chinese airspace and see if you can fly around on top of Beijing or Moscow for an hour without being spotted. And no one's going to do that. So you have this quasi-mutually assured destruction where, yes, those countries could, definitely nuke each other. They could probably conduct precision strikes on each other, and probably the Americans and Russians, if they really tried, could launch a cruise missile that killed Donald Trump. But no one's going to do that because you could respond in kind. So everyone is treading around quite gingerly. Everyone is looking at the traffic produced by the 3 school janitors at UKMTO and looking at the shipping going through the Gulf and wondering how long their country can last without Gulf energy. The UK, for example, gets gas from Azerbaijan. So there are other ways of doing this. There are pipelines across Europe, but it's all quite complicated. And with hindsight, it all feels kind of inevitable. If anyone's ever seen V for Vendetta and sees the bit where all the dominoes roll, we're kind of in a really complex 3D chess version of that. And the most powerful individuals conducting what we call kinetic strikes, so actually killing people, are obviously Trump and Netanyahu. The most powerful people with money and or energy are either the Gulf monarchies or the Iranians in the immediate area, or globally, obviously, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. The Europeans are quite important, but they're mainly focused on keeping Ukraine in the game. So if you're Estonia, you're sort of looking nervously over your shoulder towards the Gulf and the rest of Europe, but you're actually much more worried about, how many American tanks do you have over Christmas? And the Americans incidentally have quite a large tank attack. Well, they have 15 to 18 tanks in Estonia, and that makes the Estonians feel safe enough. Similar dynamics in Latvia, where they've got to deal with the Canadians. Similar dynamics in Lithuania, where the Germans have a Panzer Brigade. So everyone is sort of doing deterrence. The British are doing deterrence very, very expensively, but at the same time trying to work out how we now adapt to drones and everything else and make up for the stuff that doesn't work, which turns out to be quite a lot. The Chinese have discovered all of their military doesn't work, so that, if you think we've got problems, Xi Jinping has spent a huge chunk of his budget on military equipment that doesn't work. And he's now fired and possibly imprisoned and possibly even killed a significant number of his generals. They've certainly vanished from public view. Vladimir Putin's still trying to fight Zelensky in a war, and Zelensky was in town in London negotiating a drone deal with Britain. So everything is connected. We're in a shooting war in the Middle East, and everyone is trying to be both brave and careful simultaneously.
Why did Trump attack Iran now? Obviously, there's been the collapse in the nuclear deal, the 2015 deal, and the US is, as you mentioned, become energy sufficient by itself, so it's in a strong position. Was it just the patience had run out and there was no choice but to do that?
The story that keeps on being told, which I think is probably true, is that Netanyahu, so Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, as he has previously decided that this was the best moment to make Iran even weaker by cutting off the head of both the state but also targeting the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He'd already taken out Hezbollah. Hamas has not been destroyed, but at least it's been degraded. He's done as much as he can in Gaza because we mentioned earlier he can't push the population out because he'll end up fighting Egypt and Jordan. So that might be the end of the state of Israel. And if Benjamin Netanyahu cares about one thing, it's being remembered as the guy who didn't end the state of Israel. So that put the Americans in a complicated position. I mean, at the end of the day, people are very patronizing about Trump. I'm not going to comment on that. They're very patronizing about Pete Hegseth. I'm not going to comment on that either. But you've got to bear in mind that the heads of the US military, the current head of the US military, Dan Kane, used to be the chief military advisor to the CIA and used to be the person who did complicated stuff for the US military and interagency process. So that means he's someone who is extremely well known to the heads of special forces in every country, including Denmark, Britain, Canada. There is no limit to the number, the UAE, you name it. The US military is led by extremely bright men and women, some of whom Trump has fired, but some who are trained either in land or sea in the air to handle things. The head of CENTCOM is currently a naval officer who was previously deputy commander CENTCOM. His predecessor was an ex-US Special Forces army officer. The head of EUCOM, which is also the man who is also head of Supreme Commander Europe, who command NATO and British forces in the war, is an aviator, and that is because the US primarily deters Russia through its air force in Europe, and it wishes for the armies of Europe to be primarily European, as it has wanted ever since 1945. And in the Far East, so in the Pacific, so far, it is the Indo-PACOM in the last few years has always been led by a naval aviator. So that means someone who flies fast jets off carriers, someone who has commanded aircraft. So we're talking about proper Top Gun guys here. We are literally talking. These guys are all Top Gun instructors. It's the film. We're doing the film. It's Top Gun Maverick. It's definitely the film, because a Top Gun instructor who has then commanded a warship, who has then commanded a fleet, is the best person to discuss directly with the Chinese how to stop there being a war, or to discuss with the Taiwanese, the Filipinos, and the Australians how to fight China if necessary and keep them deterred. And all of that is taking place against the backdrop of the growth of AI and unmanned drones. So the way that the Americans will stop the Chinese from invading Taiwan is through undersea drones. But as soon as that technology exists, the Chinese will have almost immediately after the ability to blockade Taiwan to stop supplies getting in. Incredibly dangerous moment in the Indo-Pacific. And the last thing that's going on, of course, is space. So right now, sitting on a launch pad in Canaveral is Artemis 2, the second rocket to go around the moon that turns out not to work very well, and will be the first thing to carry humans back to near lunar space since 1972. Why is the moon important? And why is Mars important? Because both the Americans and the Chinese are trying to get there with robots that will build things. So Chinese and the Americans and the Europeans, because the European Space Agency works very closely with NASA, and the Chinese work very closely with the Russians, want to get drones up to the moon to start building a person-inhabitable lunar base by the end of this decade. And some countries, particularly the Gulf states, so the UAE is a really good example, plays both with the Russians and the Chinese and with the Europeans and the Americans. So the Gulf is where all these come together. So it's all happening in the first quarter of this year. I actually think it's fascinating, but all of these things are interlinked.
I've seen a joke online about NATO should join the Ukraine. Do you think in 10 years we're in that peculiar position where Ukraine is leading the way in this drone warfare, all this weaponry? And you mentioned earlier the sort of frustration with the British Army in their
I've expressed, let me get incredibly clear that I've expressed no frustration with the British Army whatsoever. Firstly, let's go back to Britain. There's a bunch of stuff we're good at, right? We're quite good at. We're very good at aviation engineering. Rolls-Royce jet engines are still the best thing in the world. We're quite good at fast defense innovation. There's a whole bunch of companies you've never heard of doing stuff really fast in conjunction with the Ukrainians. What we are trying to achieve is what we have been trying to achieve since 1916, which is that we do not wish to refight the Battle of the Somme with the entire population of Europe. The way that you do that, we only really want the Ukrainians to have to fight it. And the Ukrainians are already running out of people. So the ultimate aim, if you are not a psychopath, and we don't know who is a psychopath, that does make it slightly more complicated, is to get back to the point where we end up in a rough sort of stasis like the first Cold War, where this doesn't go badly wrong, and where you and readers in the Sun and viewers of this video do not have to either worry about a nuclear war breaking out overnight, as they did between 1950 or so and 1989, or worry about their children having to fight. Now, this is where it gets nasty, because the only way you can do that if you're Europe is by being at least prepared, or at least your country being prepared to conscript your young people to fight. That's something that the Baltic states have squared with. It's something that the Scandinavians have squared with. The Poles have squared with it differently because they are so worried they're not going to conscript. They're just going to train any man or woman this year who wants military training. And that will at least double the size of their military by the end of the year, probably more than that. Britain faces a multi-way discussion about how much are we going to spend on equipment. Are we just going to maintain a professional military, or do we start to follow the French and Germans down the route where we actually look at young people and middle-aged people and the sort of people who listen to podcasts? The average age of a soldier in Russia and Ukraine is about 40. So that is men who've had their children. Because, I mean, I can tell you one thing in terms that readers of the Sun will understand. I have yet to meet a single British mother of children who is prepared to see her children conscripted before her entire husband's generation is fed into the meat grinder. So that puts us in some quite interesting social discussions, which I think we will have over the next few years. There are lots of dangerous points about future, where things get dangerous around Taiwan and Ukraine and Russia. Relatively few of them are this year. Some of them are next year. Some of them are 2029. Sudan has been absolutely horrific. We're talking about possibly hundreds of thousands of deaths as the UAE, Russia, China, and the West sort of square off in a not very clever way. This is not particularly funny. It's an incredibly dangerous time. And if we get this really wrong, then one of three things will happen. Either wars will take place horribly in places like Gaza or Sudan, we won't be able to stop them, or we'll end up in a world war that feels more like World War I or World War II, and or we end up in a nuclear exchange. We need to avoid all of those, and that's not very easy. But we can do it at a sensible rate. It probably is being done at a sensible rate, and it is based on our understanding of the first Cold War. It is probably reasonable to assume that the people in charge of all of these countries, including Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, do not wish to be remembered as the person who broke the world and ended everything. So everyone, we're in a minefield. Anyone who's ever seen a Dad's Army episode will remember how you clear a minefield, right? You take your bayonet, you plug it into the ground, and then you take your knuckle. These knuckles don't work very well because I'm paralyzed from the shoulders down. And you go forward a knuckle at a time while putting your bayonet into the ground and making sure it doesn't hit anything that goes tap. And you do that very, very slowly until you don't blow up. That is currently what is happening in the world, and everyone is doing it simultaneously. It would be amusing until you go and talk to the people who are either suffering or would suffer. And I would, the ones I went to talk to when I was doing my book, The Next World War. So that means the people on the beach who live near the beaches of Taiwan, where the invasion will come. The young Taiwanese men who would fight, and one of them said, some people are brave, some people are scared. I'm just one of the scared ones. And of course, people in Eastern Europe, particularly Russian speakers in, say, the Baltic states. And you will find that they are worried for their children, frankly, because that is all that ever really, really happens. We're about to hit the 110th anniversary of the Somme this summer. And if you think about the legacy of that, the reason we teach our children war poetry, the reason we teach our children about the First World War, the reason I think people will understand this, including Sun readers and anyone who's had a family, which is pretty much everybody, because you don't get to exist any other way, is that the First World War was absolutely awful. And the Second World War was not much better if you were Britain, and a lot worse if you were Russian. So everyone gets that you need to avoid this stuff. Everyone gets you need to avoid nuclear war, and everyone gets that feeding men and women of any age into something that looks like the Western Front, the Battle of the Somme, or Stalingrad is a very bad idea. And they are trying very hard for this not to go over the edge. And we've never done this globally in the era of nuclear weapons quite like this before. So it's a very complicated world. The reason I wrote this book and the reason I called it The Next World War, The New Age of Global Conflict, and the Fight to Stop It is that there's a risk of a world war. There is a global confrontation with lots of conflict, and we are trying to stop it getting worse. And as the Chief of the General Staff, Sir Rowley Walker, head of the British Army, said today, we need everyone, by which he meant his people, but unfortunately we also mean everyone else, to be as ready as they can be. Because that is how we stop it happening.
Can I ask before you leave, on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 is the year 1939, how close are we to a truly global multi-theatre war?
I mean, it's somewhere between 1935 and May 1940. It is. If you're in Ukraine, it's already August 1940, and the Battle of Britain has been going on for 4 years. If you're Britain, it's the 1970s, because we're still at the stage of thinking it's a sitcom. It isn't. And the sitcoms weren't designed to be funny. The reason that the sitcoms that my parents' generation grew up with were about the Second World War was because we were bright enough to stay out of Vietnam. And so the 1960s and 70s were about not doing that. I mean, I think, so I'm 44 and I'm British Army acting captain. So I've already done I've done 2 years in uniform doing interesting stuff during COVID in Ukraine. And I suspect I'll be back in uniform again doing something interesting at some point, and I'm still a reservist. I think where Britain has gone wrong, or the narrative has gone wrong, is that when people like the Chief of Defence Staff talk about every family learning the meaning of sacrifice, they sort of make it sound as if we mean lots of getting people killed. What we actually mean is people giving up weekends or 6 months of their life to learn heavy rescue or first aid. That is also a sacrifice. I think we need to have a very serious conversation with our government and British people about what they are prepared to do. And what we will discover pretty much immediately is that everyone is prepared to do almost everything, including risking their life, to protect the people that they care about. And at that stage, everything is fine and you need to adapt. But I don't think we're quite there yet. And I think for a variety of reasons, not least that we have very rarely faced an existential threat of invasion, aside from 1940 for about 10 months, 8 months. The Napoleonic Wars for about 4 or 5 years before Trafalgar. And 1066, and we lost, and the French took over. We're not very good at thinking about that because we have had it too good for too long on a 1,000-year basis. If you are Poland and you get overrun every 60 years, this is quite easy. If you're Ukraine and it suddenly happened in an afternoon, it's quite easy. We have the English Channel to protect us and we think we're safer than we are. But, having said that, I'm still proud of being British. I'm still damn proud of the men and women I've both led and been led by. I'm still proud to work for the Chief of General Staff, Sir Rowley Walker, who's only met me once, and I think forgot who I was, which is generally true of most members of the British Army. And I'm proud to be a journalist, which is which is about speaking truth to power, which in some places gets you cut to pieces with a bone saw. And I broke my neck covering a civil war in Sri Lanka 20 years ago this year. So I think we'll be okay because I've survived that, and I don't think I'm abnormally tough or bright or anything really. I'm an okay storyteller, but that's about it.